The Undisclosed Throne. Premise: a young man named Revan Williams lives a simple life as an odd jobber in a small town. He is known as an ordinary man who is kind, hardworking, and likes to help others. However, behind his simple life, Revan is actually the sole heir of a giant business empire inherited by his family. To avoid family conflicts, power struggles, and threats from business enemies, Revan chooses to hide his identity. He lives as an ordinary man, observing the world without being seen as important. However, when his company is on the verge of collapse, due to the actions of his greedy half-brother, Revan must come out of the shadows and show who he really is. The Undisclosed Throne. In a quiet corner of town, a young man named Revan lives a simple life. He works as a mechanic in a small workshop, wearing a shabby uniform with his hands always covered in oil. For him, it's not just a job. It's protection. No one knew who he really was. To his friends, Revan was just an ordinary guy, a hard worker, didn't talk much, and always refused when asked out for a drink on the weekends. But there was something strange about him. People often wondered why a mechanic like him could speak so intelligently. How could Revan understand complicated things, like business and investments, when he was just a garage guy? And what was even stranger, whenever a rich person came to fix their car, Revan looked so calm, as if he was used to their world, if he wasn't an ordinary person. One day, in the heat of the noisy workshop, an old man in an expensive suit stepped in. Everyone there immediately noticed him. Someone like him shouldn't be in a place like this. The man walked slowly towards Revan. His gaze was sharp, full of judgment. Then, in a deep voice, he said, "You've played long enough, young master." The room was suddenly silent. Revan, who was tightening bolts under the hood of the car, paused for a moment. He did not immediately turn around. He did not show any surprise. Only after a few seconds, he stood up, wiped his hands with a dirty rag, then looked at the man. He smiled a little, calm, in control. "You have the wrong person, sir," he said softly. But the old man just chuckled. "Don't play dumb, kid. You know very well what's going on." Without waiting for a reply, the man turned and left. But before exiting the workshop, he had time to whisper softly loud enough for Revan to hear. "Your time is almost up." That night, Revan sat in his small boarding room. Nothing fancy. No expensive things. Just a bed, a wooden table, and an old cell phone on top of it. However, it was the cell phone that held the truth he had been hiding. A message appeared on the screen. "The company is in danger. If you keep quiet, everything will fall into the wrong hands." Revan stared at the message for a long time. He let out a long breath, then turned off his phone. He didn't want to go back. He had already left that world. A world of wealth, intrigue, and betrayal. But could he run away forever? Because out there someone was watching her. Behind the curtains of her window, a black car was quietly parked in the distance. And in it, someone was staring at Revan's boarding house. Waiting. Watching. Because right now, the game had just begun. A quiet night. In his small boarding room, Revan still sat in silence. His cell phone lay on the table, the screen dark as if waiting for an answer. He closed his eyes for a moment. In his head, he knew. This was no longer about a choice. This was a warning. If she remained silent, everything would fall into the wrong hands. Meanwhile, in a black car parked in the distance, a man in a black suit opened his cell phone screen. He saw the latest message from a mysterious person. "Target is still refusing to move. Keep watching. Don't let him get away." The man smiled slightly, then picked up the phone. "Our young master is still stubborn. What should we do?" On the other end, someone's heavy voice sounded. Cold and certain. "Force him out of hiding." And that night, the plan began. The next morning, Revan woke up with a strange feeling. It was as if something had been watching him since last night. As he prepared to head to the workshop, he noticed something odd. A new message on his cell phone. But this time, it wasn't from a lawyer. It was just a picture of his dorm from a distance. In one short sentence, "We know where you are." Revan felt a chill run down the back of his neck. Meanwhile, at the workshop, ... Rio, his best friend, was waiting with a worried face. "Bro, someone was looking for you this morning." "In an expensive car? In a suit, like someone important?" Revan was silent. He had expected this. "What did they say?" he asked. Rio shook his head. "They didn't say anything. Just left this." Rio handed Revan a black envelope. Revan took it carefully. Inside was just a plain business card with one name written neatly in the center. Felix Williams. Instantly, old memories swirled in Revan's head. Felix Williams. The man who had been eyeing his family's throne? Revan clenched his fists. He knew. This was no longer just a warning. They wanted to force him back into the world he had left behind. Outside the workshop, another black car was parked silently. From inside, a man in an expensive suit observed Revan. He picked up his cell phone and smiled. "The target has gotten the message. We're just waiting for the next step." Then the man said, quietly, almost as if whispering to himself, "Let's see, young master. How long can you run?" It was a quiet night, but not for Revan. He sat in his dorm room, staring at the black business card. Felix Williams. A name he had tried to forget for years. A name that meant trouble. He knew that if Felix had started moving, this was no longer just a threat. This was the last warning before the storm really came. Revan took a deep breath, then burned the business card on the end of his cigarette. He watched as the small flame burned the black paper, eventually turning to ash in his hand. But in his heart he knew, burning the name would not erase the threat. The next day, Revan entered the workshop as usual. But something felt different. The workshop was silent. There was no Rio. There were no other workers. And in the center of the room stood 3 men in black suits. One of them stepped forward. "Young Master Revan," he said, with a cold smile. "Our boss wants to talk to you now." Revan crossed his arms, his eyes remaining cold. "I don't know who you are, and I'm not the person you're looking for," he said casually. But the man just chuckled. "Oh, we know who you are." Then he took out a cell phone from his coat pocket. He pressed something, and the screen showed a picture of Rio, Revan's best friend. Sitting in a car with his hands tied and his mouth gagged, Revan felt his blood boil. The man approached, then whispered softly, "So, still want to pretend to be an ordinary person?" A few hours later, Revan sat inside a fancy restaurant right in the center of the city. In front of him sat a man who had been a dark shadow on his family. Felix Williams, relaxing with a red wine in his hand. Felix smiled like someone who had just won a big bet. "It's been a long time, Revan," he said with a satisfied tone. Revan was silent, his eyes sharp as knives. Felix took a sip of his wine, then looked at Revan with an expression full of judgment. "You think you can hide forever? This world is not for cowards who run away from their destiny." Revan clenched his fists under the table. "I'm not part of that world anymore." Felix grinned. "Oh, but that world will never let you go. Especially when your family's company almost collapsed. Didn't you know? The people in it started selling shares too. People like me." Revan gave Felix a sharp look. Felix chuckled, then leaned back. He said, "Tell you what, I've given you a simple choice," he said. He held up one finger. "First, you stay hidden, and I'll take everything. Not only your family's company, but also your best friend. Then," he held up a second finger. "Second, you come back, fight me, and we'll see who survives." Felix looked at her with a sly smile. "Easy choice, right?" Revan was silent. He could feel the world he had been avoiding finally pulling him back. There was no way out anymore. Outside the restaurant, as Revan walked out, his head was full of whirling thoughts. He picked up his phone, stared at the black screen for a while, then finally turned it back on. Wusher Jia unread messages. Dozens of missed calls from his family's lawyer. Breaking news! The family company's stock had started to plummet. Revan closed his eyes. Then, for the first time in a long time, he typed a message. Arrange a meeting with the board of directors. I'll be back. The phone vibrated briefly. Then, a reply came in. We've been expecting you, Mr. Revan. Revan took a deep breath. He knew the game had just begun. To be continued.